Sarah's hands trembled as she gripped the metal rail of the empty gurney, her knuckles white against the sterile chrome. The stranger, he couldn't be the same man, it was impossible, stood 15 feet away in the fluorescent glare, yet somehow seemed to exist in softer light, as if the harsh hospital illumination bent around him like water around a stone. "You're not real," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the mechanical wheeze of the ventilation system. "I was 12, hypothermic, traumatized. My mind created. You saved my life, little light." His smile was gentle, patient, the same expression she remembered from that night when the world had gone white with snow and red with blood. "Your grandmother told you I would return when the burden became too heavy to carry alone." The mention of her grandmother sent ice through Sarah's veins. Nai had been dead for 15 years, taking with her the only person who'd believed Sarah's impossible story about the dying stranger and the warmth that had flowed from her 12-year-old hands like liquid starlight. "Dr. Chen." Sarah spun toward the voice, her heart hammering. Nurse Patricia Martinez stood in the doorway, her scrubs wrinkled from their 18-hour shift, concern creasing her weathered face. "You okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." Sarah's gaze snapped back to where the stranger had stood. Empty space, only the lingering scent of winter air and something else, frankincense maybe, or the peculiar smell of snow falling on bare earth. "I'm fine," Sarah lied, forcing her breathing to steady. "Just tired." Patricia's dark eyes didn't buy it for a second. "Honey, you've been staring at that trauma bay for 20 minutes. Mrs. Kowalski's family is asking for you. They want to know about the arrangements." Mrs. Kowalski, 73 years old, massive stroke, brain dead, before the ambulance had even reached the hospital. The third death this week that would fuel the malpractice lawyer's case against her. Sarah could already hear David Morrison's smooth voice in tomorrow's deposition. "Dr. Chen, would you say your recent performance indicates a pattern of negligence?" "Tell them I'll be right there," Sarah said, straightening her lab coat with practiced precision. She'd learned long ago that survival in medicine meant compartmentalizing. Grief in one box, guilt in another, the inexplicable memories of childhood miracles locked away in the deepest vault of all. But as she walked toward the family conference room, Sarah caught her reflection in the dark window overlooking the parking lot. For just a moment, she saw herself at 12 again. Black hair in messy braids, glasses sliding down her nose, small hands glowing with impossible warmth as life flowed back into a stranger's broken body. "Remember, little light," her grandmother's voice echoed across the years. "Some gifts sleep until the soul is ready to carry them." The Kowalski family waited in the sterile conference room with red-rimmed eyes and the hollow look of people whose world had just collapsed. Sarah delivered the news she'd given 1,000 times before, the medical facts, the gentle explanations, the careful words that acknowledged grief without admitting liability. She signed the paperwork with steady hands, offered resources for grief counseling, and maintained the professional composure that had carried her through medical school, residency, and 6 years of emergency medicine. But inside, something was cracking. By the time Sarah finally left the hospital, dawn was painting the Montana sky in shades of pearl and rose gold. The February air bit at her exposed skin as she crossed the parking lot, her breath forming white clouds that reminded her too much of that long-ago winter night. Devil's Creek was only 15 miles from here, winding through the same pine forests where she'd once found a dying man and somehow, impossibly, brought him back. She slid into her Honda Civic and sat for a moment, hands resting on the steering wheel. The rational part of her mind, the part trained in evidence-based medicine and scientific methodology, insisted that stress and sleep deprivation had triggered a hallucinatory episode. Hospitals were pressure cookers. Even experienced physicians sometimes cracked under the weight of repeated loss. But her hands tingled with phantom warmth, the same sensation she'd felt 20 years ago when life had flowed through her fingers like electricity made of love. Sarah's phone buzzed. A text from her lawyer. Deposition moved to tomorrow, 9 a.m. Morrison's pushing hard. "We need to talk." She closed her eyes and leaned back against the headrest. 3 dead patients, a lawsuit that could end her career, and now hallucinations of impossible strangers who knew her grandmother's pet name. Maybe it was time to admit that Dr. Sarah Chen, competent, rational, scientifically minded physician, was finally falling apart. The engine turned over on the second try, and Sarah pulled out of the parking lot as the first real snow of February began to fall, each flake catching the morning light like tiny stars descending to earth. She didn't see the figure standing in the hospital's shadow, watching her leave with ancient eyes full of infinite patience. The drive home through Millfield's empty streets felt like traveling through a snow globe, silent, crystalline, and somehow separate from the real world. Sarah's Honda navigated the familiar route on autopilot while her mind replayed the impossible encounter in Trauma Bay 3. The rational explanations she'd constructed during the Kowalski meeting crumbled with each mile, leaving behind only the phantom tingle in her palms and the echo of a voice calling her little light. Her apartment sat above Chen's Golden Dragon, the Chinese restaurant her uncle had owned for 30 years. The neon sign flickered weakly in the grey morning light, casting red and gold reflections on the fresh snow. Sarah climbed the narrow stairs to her second-floor refuge, each step feeling heavier than the last. The apartment was small but precisely organized. Medical journals stacked in neat piles, diplomas hanging straight on white walls, everything in its proper place. It was the home of someone who'd spent years proving she belonged in a world that had once seemed impossible to reach. The daughter of immigrants who'd sacrificed everything so their only child could become a doctor. The scholarship kid who'd graduated valedictorian from Stanford Medical School. The emergency physician who'd chosen rural Montana over lucrative urban practices because someone had to serve the forgotten corners of America. All of it now threatened by 3 deaths and a malpractice suit that could strip away her license, her livelihood, her entire identity. Sarah's phone rang as she kicked off her snow-dampened shoes. Her uncle's name flashed on the screen. "Way, Sarah, you just get home?" Uncle James's voice carried the particular weariness of someone who'd spent 40 years working before dawn. "I heard the snow starting. Bad night at hospital?" "Long night," she said, sinking onto her couch. Through the thin walls, she could hear him moving around the restaurant kitchen below, beginning prep for another day. "How's business?" Slow, always slow in winter. His Mandarin accent had softened over the decades, but never disappeared. "You eating enough? I have leftover mapo tofu." The offer was code for deeper concern. Uncle James had been her surrogate father since her parents died in a car accident during her residency, the steady presence who attended her graduation, who celebrated her first day at Millfield, General, who asked no questions about her choice to stay in a small Montana town instead of pursuing the prestigious career everyone expected. "I'm okay," she lied. "Just tired." "Tired is different from okay." His voice sharpened with the intuition of someone who'd watched her grow from a grieving teenager into an overworked physician. "Something else wrong. I can hear it." Sarah closed her eyes, fighting the urge to confess everything. The lawsuit, the hallucination, the 20-year-old memory that medical school had never quite explained away. But Uncle James had sacrificed enough for her dreams. He didn't need to carry her burdens too, just work stress. "I'll be fine." A long pause. Your Nai used to say the same thing when something was eating at her spirit. "Just tired, James, just tired." But tired doesn't make hands shake like scared birds. The observation hit too close to home. Sarah looked down at her trembling fingers, still tingling with phantom warmth. "I have to go," she said quickly. "Thank you for checking on me." "Sarah." But she'd already hung up, cutting off his worried protests. The apartment felt smaller suddenly, the walls pressing in with the weight of everything she stood to lose. Her medical degree hung beside her residency certificate, formal acknowledgements of a decade spent learning to save lives through science and skill. Below them, barely visible in a small frame, sat a faded photo of her grandmother. The only person who'd ever believed a 12-year-old's impossible story about healing a dying stranger with nothing but touch and prayer. Her phone buzzed with a text from Patricia. "Take care of yourself, honey. These things pass. You're a good doctor." Then another from Dr. Williams, the Chief of Staff. "Sarah, take tomorrow off. You need rest before the deposition. That's an order." And finally, her lawyer again. "Morrison's team filed additional documents. We should meet tonight if possible. This is serious." Sarah set the phone aside and walked to her kitchen window, which overlooked Main Street. Below, Millfield was waking up, snowplows scraping asphalt, early commuters brushing off windshields, the ordinary rhythm of a small town enduring another Montana winter. This was her life, her community, the place she'd chosen to build something meaningful after years of academic achievement and professional climbing. Now it might all disappear because 3 people had died despite her best efforts, and a stranger with impossible eyes had appeared in her trauma bay, speaking her grandmother's secret name. Sarah's reflection stared back from the window glass. 32 years old, exhausted, alone, except for an uncle who worried about her and colleagues who were already distancing themselves from the malpractice scandal. She'd spent 20 years running from the memory of healing hands and whispered prayers, building a rational life on scientific foundation. But standing in her empty apartment as snow fell like stars, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was finally catching up to her. The feeling crystallized into certainty 3 hours later when Sarah found the letter. She dozed fitfully on the couch, medical journals scattered around her like paper shields against the encroaching lawsuit. When the doorbell's harsh buzz jolted her awake, the afternoon light had already begun its early winter fade. Sarah stumbled to the intercom, expecting a delivery driver or perhaps Uncle James with unsolicited mapo tofu. Instead, silence. Then footsteps retreating down the external stairs. Sarah waited 5 minutes before cracking open her door. The hallway was empty, but a single white envelope lay on the worn carpet, her name written in elegant script that made her breath catch. She recognized that handwriting, impossible as it seemed. She'd seen it once before, 20 years ago, in a thank-you note her grandmother had treasured until her dying day. The envelope contained no return address, no postmark. Inside, cream-colored paper bore a single sentence in the same careful script: "The children at St. Mary's Hospital need you tonight. Room 314. Come alone." Sarah's hands shook as she read the words again, searching for some rational explanation. St. Mary's was in Billings, 90 minutes away, a children's hospital she'd rotated through during medical school. Room 314 meant nothing to her, but somehow the number felt significant, like a half-remembered dream clawing toward consciousness. Her phone rang. The caller ID showed an unknown number with a Billings area code. "Dr. Chen." The voice was young, female, tight, with barely controlled panic. "This is Rebecca Martinez, pediatric nurse at St. Mary's. I'm calling because—" This is going to sound crazy, but a patient specifically asked for you. Sarah's throat went dry. "I don't understand. I'm not affiliated with St. Mary's." "I know. That's why this is so strange. We have a 7-year-old boy, Tommy Garrett, brought in this morning with massive internal bleeding after a car accident. He's been unconscious since arrival, but 20 minutes ago he woke up and started asking for the doctor with healing hands. He described you perfectly, Dr. Chen, down to the scar on your left temple." Sarah's free hand flew involuntarily to the thin white line above her eyebrow, a childhood remnant from the same winter storm that had nearly killed her before she found the stranger by Devil's Creek. No one outside Millfield would know about that scar. Even fewer would connect it to her. "That's impossible," she whispered. "Ma'am, I've been a pediatric nurse for 15 years. I've seen children do impossible things." Rebecca's voice carried desperate hope wrapped in professional skepticism. "Tommy's vitals have been crashing all day. We've tried everything. 3 surgeries, experimental medications, prayer circles from half the churches in Montana. Nothing's working." But when he mentioned your name, something changed. His heart rate stabilized. The bleeding slowed. Sarah gripped the letter tighter, the cream paper crinkling like autumn leaves. How did you get my number?" A pause. That's the strangest part. Tommy said a man visited him. Tall, dark hair, kind eyes. The man told him you'd know what to do, that you had gifts that sleep until the soul is ready. Dr. Chen, we don't have any record of this visitor. Security cameras show no one entering Tommy's room. The phantom warmth in Sarah's palms flared like a struck match. Gifts that sleep until the soul is ready. Her grandmother's exact words, spoken in Mandarin on a night when 12-year-old Sarah had tried to convince herself that miracles were just fever dreams born from hypothermia and trauma. "I can't help you," Sarah said quickly. "I'm facing a malpractice suit. I can't even practice in my own hospital right now." "Please." Rebecca's composure cracked. "Tommy's parents are driving up from Denver, but the roads are bad and they won't make it before—" Her voice broke. "Dr. Chen, this little boy is going to die tonight unless something changes, and somehow he knows you can change it." Sarah closed her eyes, seeing the impossible stranger's patient smile, feeling the weight of 3 recent deaths and a lawsuit that would destroy everything she'd built. She thought of her medical oath, first, do no harm, and the bitter irony of a system that might strip away her ability to heal just when healing seemed to matter most. "What room did you say?" 314. "Dr. Chen, I don't know what Tommy thinks you can do that our surgeons can't, but—" "I'll be there in 90 minutes, Sarah said, and hung up before her rational mind could override the decision. The drive to Billings stretched ahead like a bridge between 2 worlds, the life she'd built on scientific foundation, and something else entirely, something that had been calling to her since she was 12 years old and desperate enough to believe in miracles. As Sarah grabbed her keys and headed for the door, she realized she stood at a crossroads that would define not just her career, but her understanding of what it truly meant to heal. Behind her, the letter fluttered to the floor, its message delivered. Outside, the snow fell heavier, as if heaven itself was holding its breath. Sarah's hand froze on the doorknob as the weight of her decision crashed down like an avalanche. 90 minutes to Billings, 90 minutes to walk into a children's hospital where she had no privileges, no authority, no legal right to treat patients, especially while facing a malpractice suit that could destroy her career with a single misstep. She leaned against the door, her medical bag heavy in her other hand. "What am I doing?" The rational voice in her head, the one honed by years of evidence-based medicine, screamed warnings. Treating a patient without hospital privileges was grounds for immediate license suspension. Crossing state lines to practice without authorization could trigger federal charges. And if something went wrong with Tommy Garrett, if the boy died while she was in the room, David Morrison would use it as ammunition to paint her as a reckless physician who ignored protocols and boundaries. But what if something goes right? The treacherous thought slipped past her defenses before she could stop it. Sarah pressed her forehead against the cool wood of the door, remembering the impossible warmth that had flowed through her 12-year-old hands 20 years ago. The stranger's fatal wounds closing under her touch, his eyes opening with recognition that had felt older than mountains. A phone buzzed. "Morrison's office, Dr. Chen. We need to discuss new developments before tomorrow's deposition. Available for emergency consultation this evening?" Sarah stared at the text until the words blurred. The smart play was obvious. Stay home, meet with her lawyer, prepare her defense against the 3 malpractice counts that threatened everything she'd built. Uncle James had sacrificed his retirement savings to help with legal fees. Her colleagues at Millfield General were already distancing themselves, afraid the scandal would contaminate their own careers. She couldn't afford another mistake. But 7-year-old Tommy Garrett was dying 90 minutes away, asking for a doctor he never met, describing healing hands that defied every law of medicine and physics. Sarah's reflection stared back from the hallway mirror, exhausted, alone, teetering on the edge of professional suicide. She thought of her parents, who died believing their daughter would become the kind of doctor who saved lives through skill and dedication. They'd never known about their child's one impossible night by Devil's Creek, never heard the story of healing hands and whispered prayers that her grandmother had carried like a sacred secret. Some gifts sleep until the soul is ready to carry them, little light. The memory of her grandmother's voice made Sarah's chest tight with longing. Nai had been the only person who'd believed without question, who'd looked at her granddaughter's trembling hands and seen something miraculous instead of medical impossibility. She'd died during Sarah's second year of medical school, taking with her the last connection to a world where healing could happen beyond the boundaries of science. Sarah pulled out her phone and scrolled to Uncle James's contact. Her finger hovered over the call button. He'd tried to talk sense into her, remind her of everything at stake. The restaurant barely broke even. He couldn't help with more legal fees if this gamble backfired. And if she lost her license, if the malpractice suit destroyed her career, what then? A decade of medical training reduced to debt and regret. But Tommy Garrett knew about her scar, about healing hands, about gifts that slept until souls were ready. The letter lay crumpled on her apartment floor, its elegant script seeming to pulse with purpose. Sarah had spent 20 years building walls between herself and that childhood night. Medical school, residency, years of emergency medicine that proved healing could be explained through pharmacology and procedure. She'd been so careful, so controlled, measuring her life in evidence-based increments. 3 patients had died this week despite her best efforts. Scientific medicine, for all its precision and power, had limits. Sometimes skill wasn't enough. Sometimes everything you'd learned in medical school couldn't bridge the gap between life and death. The phantom warmth in her palms flared again, stronger now, like embers stirring to life after years of dormancy. Sarah flexed her fingers, remembering how light had seemed to flow between them once, how a stranger's broken body had responded to something beyond medical explanation. What if she couldn't save Tommy? What if 20 years of suppressing her gift had burned it out? What if she arrived at St. Mary's to find nothing but empty hands and another dead child to add to Morrison's case file? But what if she could? Sarah grabbed her keys and medical bag, shoving doubts into the same mental compartment where she stored grief and guilt and impossible memories. She'd made her choice in the space between heartbeats, the same way she'd decided to kneel beside a dying stranger 2 decades ago. Some decisions couldn't survive rational analysis. As she locked her apartment door, Sarah caught sight of her medical diploma one last time through the window. Tomorrow's deposition would determine whether she kept the right to call herself doctor. Tonight, she'd discover whether healing had ever required a license at all. The drive to Billings stretched ahead like a bridge between worlds, the one she'd built and the one calling her home. The highway stretched before Sarah like a river of asphalt, disappearing into winter darkness. With each mile that passed beneath her Honda's worn tires, the weight of her decision settled deeper into her bones. She'd crossed the Rubicon the moment she'd turned the key in her ignition. There was no rational explanation for driving 90 minutes through a Montana snowstorm to treat a child she'd never met at a hospital where she had no authority. Her phone had buzzed twice more since leaving Millfield, once from Morrison's office, then again from her lawyer. Sarah had let both calls go to voicemail, unable to stomach the thought of explaining where she was going or why. How could she tell anyone that a dying 7-year-old had somehow known about her childhood scar, her grandmother's secret words, the impossible night that medical school had never quite explained away? The snow fell heavier now, fat flakes caught in her headlight beams like moths drawn to flame. Sarah gripped the steering wheel tighter, feeling the familiar phantom warmth pulse through her palms. 20 years she'd spent suppressing this sensation, explaining it away as stress response or muscle memory. But sitting alone in her car with the heater blowing and NPR playing softly on the radio, she couldn't deny what her body remembered. Light flowing between her 12-year-old fingers, a stranger's wounds closing under her touch, eyes that held recognition older than mountains. "Jesus," she whispered into the darkness, then caught herself. The word felt different now, less reflexive curse than involuntary prayer. Her grandmother had been Buddhist, Uncle James was agnostic, and Sarah herself hadn't seen the inside of a church since medical school. But something about this night, this drive, this impossible summons, felt sacred in a way that made her chest tight with longing and terror. The GPS announced 15 miles to Billings. Sarah's hands began to shake against the steering wheel as the full magnitude of what she was attempting crashed over her. She was driving toward professional suicide based on nothing more than a mysterious letter and a phone call from a nurse she'd never met. If Tommy Garrett died while she was in the room, if anyone discovered she'd treated a patient without privileges while facing malpractice charges, her career would be over. Not suspended, not sanctioned, finished. But if she could help him... Sarah's phone rang, startling her from spiraling thoughts. Rebecca Martinez's number flashed on the dashboard display. "Dr. Chen, please tell me you're still coming." The nurse's voice carried barely controlled panic. "Tommy's taken a turn for the worse. We've lost him twice in the last hour, had to resuscitate both times. The attending wants to call time of death, but I convinced him to wait. I told him you were en route for consultation." "I'm 10 minutes out," Sarah said, pressing harder on the accelerator despite the worsening road conditions. "Rebecca, I need you to understand something. I don't have privileges at St. Mary's. Legally, I can't treat Tommy directly." "I don't care about legal right now," Rebecca shot back. "This little boy asked for you by name. He described healing hands and gifts that sleep until souls are ready. Dr. Chen, I've been doing this long enough to know when we're dealing with something beyond medical explanation." The line crackled with static as Sarah rounded a curve, the lights of Billings finally visible through the snow. "What did he say exactly?" "Tommy, I mean..." "He woke up about an hour ago, looked right at me and said, 'The lady doctor is coming, the one who helped the broken man when she was little.' Then he closed his eyes and started coding." Rebecca's voice broke slightly. "His parents called 20 minutes ago. The roads are too bad. They can't make it from Denver tonight. If something's going to happen, it has to be now." Sarah pulled into St. Mary's parking lot, her hands trembling as she turned off the engine. Through the hospital's windows, she could see the controlled chaos of a busy children's ward, nurses moving with practiced urgency, monitors beeping their electronic prayers, the endless dance between life and death that had defined her adult existence. "I'm here," she told Rebecca, grabbing her medical bag. "Room 314. Third floor, East Wing." "Dr. Chen?" The nurse's voice caught. "Whatever this is, whatever Tommy thinks you can do, just know that everyone here has done everything medically possible. If something miraculous happens tonight, it won't be because we failed him. It'll be because you brought something we don't have." Sarah ended the call and sat in her car for one more moment, snow accumulating on her windshield like a curtain between worlds. Tomorrow's deposition waited. Morrison's lawsuit threatened everything she'd built. Her rational mind screamed that she was walking into professional destruction based on childhood memories that couldn't possibly be real. But Tommy Garrett was dying 3 floors above her, and somehow he knew her name. Sarah shouldered her bag and stepped out into the storm, leaving behind the last vestiges of the careful, controlled life she'd constructed. The automatic doors of St. Mary's Hospital opened before her like gates to another realm entirely. The fluorescent lights of St. Mary's Hospital hit Sarah like a physical force, sterile and unforgiving after the soft darkness of the storm. Her wet boots squeaked against polished linoleum as she approached the reception desk, acutely aware that she was crossing a threshold that would change everything. The night clerk looked up with tired eyes, clipboard poised like a weapon of bureaucracy. "I'm here to see Tommy Garrett," Sarah said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Room 314. Rebecca Martinez called me." The clerk's fingers flew over her keyboard. "Are you family?" Visiting hours ended at 9, and given the patient's condition... "Dr. Sarah Chen," she interrupted, pulling out her medical license with hands that barely trembled. "Consulting physician." It was a lie wrapped in technical truth. The clerk studied her credentials with the practiced skepticism of someone who'd seen too many people try to bend hospital rules. Sarah held her breath, waiting for questions she couldn't answer, explanations that would unravel before she spoke them. "Third floor, East Wing," the clerk said finally, handing back the license. "Elevators around the corner." The ride to the third floor felt like ascending through layers of atmosphere, each ding of the floors marking her passage into thinner air. Sarah caught her reflection in the polished steel doors, pale, determined, clutching her medical bag like a shield against the impossible. The elevator shuddered to a stop, and the doors opened to reveal a hallway that smelled of antiseptic and barely contained grief. Rebecca Martinez materialized before Sarah could take 3 steps, moving with the predatory efficiency of a pediatric nurse who'd learned that seconds mattered. She was younger than her voice had suggested, maybe 30, with kind eyes rimmed in exhaustion and dark hair escaping from a ponytail that had seen too many emergencies. "Dr. Chen, thank God." Rebecca's relief was palpable. "I wasn't sure you'd actually come." "I'm here," Sarah said, though part of her still couldn't believe it. "How is he?" Rebecca's expression darkened as they walked toward room 314, hanging on by threads. The attending, Dr. Kovac. "He's good, but he's running out of options. 3 surgical repairs on internal bleeding that keeps finding new places to start. We've pushed more blood products than a kid his size should be able to handle." They stopped outside a door marked with cheerful cartoon animals that seemed obscene given the circumstances. Through the window, Sarah could see machines clustered around a small bed like electronic vultures, their displays painting urgent hieroglyphs of a life in crisis. "Dr. Chen?" A man's voice, crisp with authority and frayed with exhaustion. Sarah turned to find a tall physician in scrubs approaching, his badge identifying him as Dr. Marcus Kovac, Chief of Pediatric Surgery. His eyes held the particular weariness that came from fighting death too many nights in a row. "Dr. Kovac," Sarah replied, extending her hand. "Thank you for allowing me to consult." His handshake was firm, appraising. "Rebecca says you have experience with cases like this, though I'll admit I'm not sure what cases like this means anymore." He gestured toward Tommy's room. "We've done everything by the book. 3 surgeries, experimental clotting factors, prayer circles from half the churches in Montana. That boy should have died 6 hours ago, but something's keeping him here." Sarah felt heat building in her palms, a warmth that had nothing to do with the hospital's aggressive heating system. "May I see him?" Dr. Kovac studied her face with the intensity of someone accustomed to reading subtle signs of competence and deception. Whatever he saw must have satisfied him, because he nodded toward the door. 5 minutes. His vitals can't handle much stimulation. The moment Sarah stepped into room 314, the machine's electronic symphony changed key. Heart rate monitors that had been screaming irregular warnings settled into steadier rhythms. Tommy Garrett lay impossibly small in the center of the medical storm, his 7-year-old body dwarfed by tubes and wires that tracked every failing system. But his eyes were open, clear, aware, and when they fixed on Sarah, she felt recognition pass between them like an electric current. "You came," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the machine's whispers. "He said you would, but I wasn't sure." Sarah approached his bedside, her medical training cataloguing his condition, even as something deeper responded to the impossible warmth radiating from this dying child. Massive internal trauma, blood loss that should have killed him hours ago, organs shutting down in cascade failure. By every measure of medical science, Tommy Garrett should not be conscious, should not be speaking, should not be alive. "Who said I would come, Tommy?" His smile was radiant despite the oxygen mask covering half his face. "The man with the kind eyes. He has scars on his hands, like you're going to have." Sarah's breath caught. Behind her, she heard Rebecca's sharp intake of air, Dr. Kovac's muttered oath. But Sarah couldn't look away from Tommy's eyes, couldn't ignore the phantom warmth now burning through her palms like fire seeking fuel. "He's waiting for you to remember," Tommy whispered, and closed his eyes as his monitors began to sing their electronic death song. The monitor's scream cut through the room like broken glass. Sarah watched Tommy's small chest fall still, his face peaceful despite the chaos erupting around him. Dr. Kovac pushed past her, calling for Rebecca as his hands moved in the practiced choreography of resuscitation. "Get the crash cart," he barked, pressing his stethoscope to Tommy's chest. No pulse, no respiratory effort. Starting compressions. But Sarah couldn't move. The heat in her palms had exploded into something beyond sensation, a burning that felt like stars being born in her hands. 20 years of medical training screamed at her to assist, to follow protocol, to let science take its course. Instead, she stood frozen as recognition crashed over her in waves. The man with kind eyes, scars on his hands. "Dr. Chen!" Rebecca's voice snapped her back to the present. The nurse had wheeled in the defibrillator, its electronic whine building toward discharge. "Are you going to help us?" Sarah stepped forward, but not toward the crash cart. Her hands moved without conscious thought, reaching for Tommy's still form. Dr. Kovac glanced up from compressions, his face flushed with exertion and something that might have been hope. "What are you doing?" he demanded as Sarah placed her palms on Tommy's chest, directly over his heart. "This isn't time for—" The words died in his throat. Sarah's hands began to glow with soft, impossible light that seemed to emanate from within her skin. The room fell silent except for the defibrillator's persistent charging whine, which Rebecca quickly shut off with trembling fingers. "Jesus Christ," Dr. Kovac whispered, stumbling backward. The light pulsed in rhythm with Sarah's heartbeat, warm and golden like sunlight filtered through honey. She felt Tommy's injuries as if they were her own. Torn blood vessels, damaged organs, the cascade failure of a small body pushed beyond endurance. But beneath the trauma, she sensed something else, a presence, waiting. "Remember." The voice came from everywhere and nowhere, familiar as her own thoughts, yet ancient beyond measure. Sarah's vision blurred, and suddenly she was 12 again, kneeling beside Devil's Creek with snow falling on her shoulders and a stranger's blood staining her mittens. But this time, she didn't look away when impossible things happened. This time, she watched as light flowed between her fingers and wounds closed like flowers blooming in reverse. The man with scars on his hands. In the memory, she finally saw his face clearly. Kind eyes that held depths like still water. A smile that spoke of suffering transformed into something luminous. And when he'd reached up to touch her cheek in thanks, she'd seen them. The marks on his palms, old scars that seemed to pulse with their own light. "Sarah," her grandmother's voice, speaking across 20 years of carefully constructed denial. "Some gifts sleep until the soul is ready to carry them." The heat in Sarah's hands crescendoed, and she felt Tommy's heart flutter back to life beneath her palms. His eyes opened, clear and aware, and when he smiled up at her, Sarah saw another face superimposed over his, ancient, beloved, scarred by nails and crowned with thorns that had long since become glory. "He's been waiting so long for you to remember," Tommy whispered. "He said the hardest part was letting you choose." Behind her, Sarah heard Dr. Kovac's sharp intake of breath, Rebecca's sob of relief or terror. The monitors resumed their electronic singing, but the rhythms were stronger now, steadier, life returning to a body that had been moments from death. But Sarah barely registered their amazement. The light fading from her hands felt like a door closing on everything she'd believed about herself, about medicine, about the clean boundaries between possible and impossible. Her carefully constructed world, medical license, scientific skepticism, rational explanations for irrational experiences, lay in ruins around her feet. "Dr. Chen." Dr. Kovac's voice carried a mixture of awe and terror that matched her own racing thoughts. "What just happened here?" Sarah looked down at her hands, expecting to see evidence of what had occurred. But they appeared ordinary, skilled surgeons' hands with short nails and faint scars from years of medical practice. Only the phantom warmth remained, pulsing like a second heartbeat. "I don't know," she whispered, the lie burning her throat. Because she did know, had always known somewhere deeper than conscious thought. The stranger by Devil's Creek. Her grandmother's stories about gifts, that slept until souls were ready, Tommy's impossible knowledge of healing hands and ancient scars. The lawsuit waiting for her in Millfield seemed like a relic from another lifetime. Tomorrow's deposition, Morrison's questions, the careful defense she'd prepared, all of it meaningless now. She'd crossed a line tonight that couldn't be uncrossed, embraced something that would change everything she thought she knew about healing, about purpose, about the thin places where heaven touched earth. Tommy's hand found hers, small fingers curling around her palm with surprising strength. "He wants to see you again," the boy whispered, "when you're ready to stop running." Sarah stared at Tommy's peaceful face, his words echoing like a challenge thrown down by the universe itself. "When you're ready to stop running." The warmth still pulsed in her palms, undeniable proof that everything she'd spent 20 years denying was not only real but claiming her with each heartbeat. "Dr. Chen?" Dr. Kovach's voice seemed to come from underwater. "I need to understand what just happened. This child was clinically dead." She turned to face him, and the fear in his eyes mirrored her own terror. Not fear of Tommy's recovery, fear of witnessing something that shattered the boundaries of medical possibility. Behind him, Rebecca stood frozen, her hands pressed to her mouth as if holding back words that might make this real. "His vitals are stabilizing," Rebecca whispered, checking the monitors with trembling fingers. "Blood pressure rising, oxygen saturation at 96%. It's like his body just decided to heal." Sarah opened her mouth to offer some rational explanation, but the words withered before she could speak them. 20 years of medical training had taught her to explain, categorize, treat with protocols and evidence-based care. None of that applied here. This was something older, deeper, terrifying in its implications. "I need to go," she said suddenly, backing toward the door. The walls felt like they were closing in, the fluorescent lights too bright, the reality of what she'd done crushing down like an avalanche. "Wait." Dr. Kovach stepped forward, his voice urgent. "Dr. Chen, you can't just walk away from this. If you have some technique, some treatment modality we don't know about." "There's no technique." The words came out harsher than she intended. "There's no protocol for this. There's no rational explanation that will make sense in your charts or my report." She was moving toward the door now, desperate to escape before the questions became demands, before someone insisted on documentation she couldn't provide. But Tommy's voice stopped her cold. "Dr. Sarah." He was sitting up now, the oxygen mask pushed aside, his color returning with miraculous speed. "He showed me things. About you, about what's coming." Against every instinct screaming at her to flee, Sarah turned back. "What things, Tommy?" "Hard choices. People who need what you can do, but you'll have to give up everything to help them." His 7-year-old eyes held depths that belonged to someone far older. "He said you already know the cost. You've been running from it since you were my age." The room spun around her. Sarah gripped the doorframe to steady herself as the full magnitude crashed over her like a breaking wave. This wasn't just about Tommy, wasn't just about one impossible healing. It was about a destiny she'd been fleeing for 2 decades, a calling that would demand everything she'd built, everything she'd believed about herself and her carefully ordered world. "The lawsuit," she whispered, understanding flooding through her with sickening clarity. "Losing those 3 patients, it's all connected, isn't it?" Tommy nodded solemnly. He said, "Sometimes we have to lose everything we think we want before we can accept what we're meant to become." Dr. Kovach moved closer, his medical curiosity overriding his fear. "Dr. Chen, I don't know what's happening here, but this child was dying. His organs were shutting down, massive blood loss, surgical repairs failing. Now look at him." He gestured at Tommy, who was sitting upright and breathing normally. "His recovery isn't just unusual, it's physically impossible." "Nothing's impossible," Tommy said quietly. That's what he taught her when she was little. But she forgot because forgetting felt safer. Sarah felt her phone buzzing insistently in her pocket. The display showed 17 missed calls from her attorney, Morrison's team, reporters who'd somehow gotten wind of her presence at St. Mary's. The deposition was in 8 hours. Her defense strategy, her career, her entire professional identity, all of it hanging by threads that were unraveling with each impossible moment. "Dr. Chen." Rebecca's voice was soft, careful. "Whatever this is, whatever gift you have, Tommy's parents are flying in from Denver tomorrow. They're going to see their son healthy when they were told to prepare for funeral arrangements. That's not something we can explain away." The weight of exposure pressed down on her. Hospital administrators would investigate. Medical boards would demand explanations. The media would turn her into either a fraud or a miracle worker, neither of which would allow her to practice medicine in peace. Her gift, she could no longer deny it was a gift, came with a price that would strip away everything she'd spent her adult life building. Tommy reached out his small hand toward her. "He said to tell you that the cross isn't punishment. It's just the shape love makes when it meets a world that's forgotten how to believe in impossible things." Sarah looked at his outstretched fingers, knowing that taking his hand would seal something irreversible. Behind her lay the life she'd constructed: medical career, rational skepticism, safe explanations for unsafe experiences. Ahead lay uncertainty, exposure, and demands she wasn't sure she had the courage to meet. The monitors sang Tommy's returning strength as Sarah faced the choice that would define everything to come. Sarah's hand trembled as she reached toward Tommy, then stopped inches from his small fingers. The weight of the decision froze her, and in that moment of hesitation, everything she'd built began to crumble. Her phone erupted with an incoming call. Morrison's name blazed across the screen like an accusation. Without thinking, she answered. "Dr. Chen, where the hell are you?" Morrison's voice cut through the hospital room's charged silence. "The deposition starts in 7 hours, and my sources tell me you're at St. Mary's performing unauthorized procedures on pediatric patients." Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. Behind Morrison's voice, she could hear other conversations, legal teams mobilizing, strategies shifting like battle formations. "How did you—" "Hospital administrators talk, doctor. Especially when emergency consultants show up unannounced and start interfering with critical cases." Morrison's tone carried the satisfaction of a predator who'd found fresh weakness. "I'm filing emergency motions as we speak. Unauthorized practice, violation of medical ethics, possible fraud charges. Your little midnight house call just became evidence of gross professional negligence." Dr. Kovac stepped forward, his expression hardening as he understood what was happening. "Who is this? What authority do they have here?" But Sarah barely heard him. Morrison's words were demolishing everything: her defense strategy, her medical license, any hope of emerging from the lawsuit intact. Worse, she realized with growing horror, Tommy's miraculous recovery would now become part of the public record. Expert witnesses would dissect every moment. Medical boards would demand investigations. The gift she'd just rediscovered would be exposed, scrutinized, destroyed. "Dr. Chen?" Rebecca's voice seemed to come from very far away. "Your phone is on speaker." Sarah looked down in shock. Her trembling fingers had inadvertently activated the speaker function. Morrison's voice filled the room, and with it, the sound of her career ending in real time. "Furthermore," Morrison continued, unaware of his expanded audience, "we have testimony from Dr. Patricia Williams suggesting your recent behavior indicates psychological instability, unauthorized night calls, emotional outbursts, possible substance abuse. Combined with tonight's actions, we're prepared to argue that Dr. Chen poses a danger to patients and should have her license suspended immediately." "That's not true," Sarah whispered, but the protest sounded weak even to her own ears. Tommy's hand fell back to his side, his young face creased with concern. Around them, the monitors continued their electronic celebration of his impossible recovery, but the joy had drained from the room like air from a punctured lung. "I'll see you at 9 a.m. sharp," Morrison concluded. "Don't bother preparing any defense for your midnight adventure. We have security footage of your arrival, witness statements from hospital staff, and documented interference with established medical protocols. Your healing touch story might work on desperate families, but it won't survive legal scrutiny." The call ended, leaving behind a silence that felt like the aftermath of an explosion. Sarah stared at her phone, watching the screen fade to black like the death of stars. Dr. Kovac cleared his throat, his earlier amazement replaced by professional caution. "Dr. Chen, I'm going to have to ask you to leave. If there are legal proceedings pending, I can't have you involved in Tommy's care." "But she saved him," Rebecca protested. "Whatever she did, it worked." "What she did was create a liability nightmare," Dr. Kovac replied, though his voice carried regret. "Tommy's recovery is documented. His previous condition is documented. Any attempt to claim miraculous intervention will be viewed as fraud or delusion by medical authorities." Sarah felt the walls closing in. The gift that had just awakened, the calling she'd finally begun to accept, it was being twisted into evidence of her incompetence. Tommy's healing, which should have been a moment of divine recognition, had become the final nail in her professional coffin. "You have to fight this," Tommy said suddenly, struggling to sit up straighter. "He showed me what happens if you stop now, all the people who need you." "I can't," Sarah interrupted, her voice breaking. "Don't you understand? They're going to destroy everything. My license, my reputation, any chance I had of helping anyone ever again." The boy's eyes filled with tears that seemed far too knowing for his age. "He said you might choose fear. He said even the disciples ran when things got too hard." The comparison hit like a physical blow. Sarah backed toward the door, her medical bag clutched against her chest like armor that no longer offered protection. Everything she'd worked for, medical school, residency, years of building expertise, was crumbling around her. And the alternative Tommy offered felt like leaping into an abyss with no guarantee of landing safely. "I'm sorry," she whispered to the boy, to Rebecca, to the ghost of her grandmother who'd tried to prepare her for this moment. "I'm sorry, but I can't lose everything." She turned and fled, leaving behind Tommy's healing warmth and the sound of monitors singing impossible life back into the world. Behind her, she heard Rebecca call her name, heard Tommy's small voice speaking words she couldn't bear to understand. The elevator doors closed like the ceiling of a tomb, carrying her down toward a future that held only ashes of what might have been. The elevator descended in mechanical silence, each floor marking another step away from the impossible warmth she'd left behind. Sarah pressed her back against the cold metal wall, her hands still tingling with phantom heat, her mind reeling from the magnitude of what she'd just abandoned. Even the disciples ran. Tommy's words followed her down like an accusation, piercing through her desperate justifications. The elevator lurched to a stop at the ground floor, doors opening onto the hospital's empty lobby. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in harsh clinical white, a fitting backdrop for the death of miracles. Sarah's feet carried her toward the exit on autopilot, but she stopped halfway across the lobby, her reflection caught in the darkened windows that faced the parking lot. The woman staring back looked like a stranger, hollow-eyed, haunted, clutching a medical bag like a lifeline to a world that was already rejecting her. "What have I done?" The question hit her with sudden, crushing force. Not what she'd done in Tommy's room that had been right, necessary, divine. What she'd done was run. Again. Just like she had at 12 years old when the stranger by Devil's Creek had tried to show her who she really was. Her phone buzzed. Another call from Morrison, probably coordinating the final assault on her career. But as Sarah stared at the screen, something else caught her attention. The time. 2:47 a.m. In exactly 6 hours and 13 minutes, she would sit across from lawyers who viewed her gift as evidence of fraud, her calling as proof of mental instability. But Tommy was upstairs right now, breathing freely because she had finally remembered who she was meant to be. Sarah's hands began to shake as the full weight of her choice crashed over her. She'd been given a second chance at her destiny, a divine appointment 20 years in the making, and she'd run because she was afraid of losing things that were already being taken from her anyway. The lawsuit was never the real test. The realization hit like lightning, illuminating everything in stark clarity. Morrison's case, the malpractice charges, the 3 patients she'd lost. It had all been preparation. a stripping away of false securities, clearing the ground for something infinitely more important than her medical license. Sarah turned back toward the elevators, her heart hammering against her ribs, but before she could take a step, the lobby doors opened behind her. Rebecca emerged, still wearing her surgical scrubs, her face flushed from running. "Dr. Chen, wait." Sarah stopped, afraid to hope. "How's Tommy?" "Completely stable. Better than stable. It's like he was never injured at all." Rebecca approached cautiously, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Dr. Kovac is trying to write a report that won't get him committed. Internal bleeding that spontaneously resolved. Surgical repairs that somehow completed themselves. He's using every medical euphemism he can think of to avoid saying miracle. That's probably wise," Sarah said bitterly. "Miracles don't hold up well in court." Rebecca studied her face in the harsh lighting. "Tommy asked me to give you something." She held out a small piece of paper, folded carefully in a child's uncertain handwriting. Sarah took it with trembling fingers, unfolding it to reveal a simple drawing, 2 hands touching, light radiating from the point of contact. Below it, in Tommy's careful letters, "He's waiting by the creek." The bottom dropped out of Sarah's world. Devil's Creek, where it all began 20 years ago, where a dying stranger had shown a terrified little girl that love could reshape reality itself, and where, somehow, impossibly, he was waiting for her now. "Rebecca." Sarah's voice came out as barely a whisper. "The man who brought Tommy in, the one who carried him into the ER. I've been thinking about him too. Security footage shows him arriving with Tommy, but there's no record of him leaving, no name on any forms. It's like he just disappeared." Sarah closed her eyes, feeling pieces of a cosmic puzzle clicking into place. The stranger, who had appeared at exactly the right moment to bring her a dying child, who had somehow known she would be at St. Mary's tonight, who had vanished as mysteriously as he'd appeared 20 years ago. "Dr. Chen," Rebecca said gently, "I don't know what's happening here. I don't know how you healed that boy or why lawyers are trying to destroy you for it. But I know what I saw tonight, and I know Tommy is alive because you remembered something the rest of us have forgotten." Sarah opened her eyes, meeting Rebecca's steady gaze. In that moment, she saw past her own fear to a truth that burned brighter than any courtroom threat. She had been chosen for this. Not just the healing, the choice. The terrifying, liberating decision to stop running from who she was meant to become. The automatic doors beckoned behind her, leading to her car, to the deposition, to the careful dismantling of her old life. But Tommy's drawing crinkled in her hand, pointing toward Devil's Creek and a confrontation 20 years in the making. Everything shifted. Sarah Chen, emergency physician, was finished. She'd been dying by degrees for months anyway, suffocating under the weight of trying to be someone she was never meant to be. But Sarah Chen, the little girl who had once touched the divine and made it bleed light, she was just beginning to awaken. The hospital parking lot stretched before them like a threshold between worlds. Sarah stood motionless beside her car, Tommy's drawing clutched in one hand, while her other gripped the keys she couldn't bring herself to use. The deposition waited in 5 hours. Devil's Creek waited in the opposite direction. "You're going, aren't you?" Rebecca's voice carried no judgment, only quiet understanding. "I don't know." Sarah's breath misted in the pre-dawn cold. 20 years I've built this life. Medical school, residency, everything I thought I wanted. And now, you remember what you were meant for." The words settled between them like a benediction. Sarah turned to face the nurse who had become an unexpected ally in the span of a few impossible hours. "Rebecca, what I did up there, healing Tommy, it's going to destroy everything. Morrison will use it against me. The medical board will call it fraud or delusion. My career, my reputation, my entire identity as a physician, it's all over. Maybe." Rebecca stepped closer, her expression thoughtful. "Or maybe that identity was never who you really were." A gust of wind swept across the parking lot, carrying with it the scent of pine and distant snow, the smell of the wilderness where her true calling waited. Sarah closed her eyes, feeling something shift inside her chest like tectonic plates finding their proper alignment. "I'm terrified," she whispered. "Good. That means it matters." Sarah opened her eyes to find Rebecca smiling, the expression transforming her tired features. "I've been a nurse for 15 years, Rebecca continued. "I've seen every kind of healing modern medicine can offer. What you did tonight, it's bigger than hospitals and licenses and legal proceedings. It's what the world needs. But I don't know how to be that person. The little girl who could heal, she disappeared when my grandmother died. I've spent 2 decades learning to be a doctor instead of remembering how to be whatever this is. Then maybe it's time to learn again." Rebecca reached into her pocket and pulled out a business card, then turned it over and wrote something on the back. "My personal number. When you're ready, after Devil's Creek, after whatever's waiting for you there, call me, because you're going to need allies who understand what they witnessed tonight." Sarah took the card, her fingers brushing Rebecca's. In that contact, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the warmth of genuine human connection, untainted by professional obligation or medical hierarchy. Someone who had seen her gift and wasn't afraid. "There's something else," Rebecca said. "Before you go. Tommy's not the only one." "What do you mean?" "Other children. I've been thinking since you left his room, remembering cases that never made sense. The leukemia patient who went into spontaneous remission after you held her hand during a seizure, the car accident victim whose internal injuries healed impossibly fast after you worked his trauma. At the time, we called it luck or good medicine or statistical anomalies." Sarah's breath caught. "How many?" "At least 6 that I can remember, maybe more. All children, all cases where conventional medicine had reached its limits, and somehow—" Rebecca paused, choosing her words carefully. "Somehow, after you touched them, they found their way back to life." The revelation hit Sarah like a physical force. She'd been healing without knowing it, her gift working through her medical training, expressing itself in ways small enough to hide from scrutiny but significant enough to save lives. All these years, she hadn't lost her calling. She'd been practicing it in secret, even from herself. "Dr. Chen," Rebecca continued, "whatever happened to you as a child, whatever this stranger at Devil's Creek showed you, it never left. It just learned to work within the boundaries you set. But now those boundaries are breaking down." Sarah looked at Tommy's drawing again, seeing past the simple sketch to the deeper truth it represented. The light radiating from touching hands wasn't just artistic fancy, it was memory, recognition, prophecy. "The lawsuit," she said slowly, understanding crystallizing. "Losing those 3 patients, it's been stripping away everything I thought I needed to be effective as a healer, making space for something else to emerge, or someone else to return." The words hung between them, charged with possibility and terror. Sarah's phone buzzed again. Morrison's team, no doubt, preparing for a battle she suddenly realized. She had no intention of fighting, not on their terms, not in their world of depositions and medical boards and carefully documented limitations. "I have to go," Sarah said, but this time the words carried resolution instead of defeat. "I know." Rebecca stepped back, giving her space to choose freely. "But remember, you're not going alone. Whatever you discover at Devil's Creek, whatever this calling demands of you, there are people who believe in what you can do, people who need what you can offer." Sarah nodded, pocketing the card and Tommy's drawing. As she unlocked her car, she felt the weight of her medical bag, all those instruments and medications, tools of a healing practice that suddenly seemed quaint compared to the power sleeping in her hands. The engine started with a quiet hum. Through her windshield, she could see the hospital rising against the dark sky, Tommy recovering in a room where miracles had interrupted medical procedure. Behind her lay Morrison's deposition and the systematic destruction of Dr. Sarah Chen. Ahead lay Devil's Creek, where a frightened little girl might finally become who she was always meant to be. Sarah drove through the pre-dawn darkness with the windows down, letting the mountain air strip away the antiseptic smell of the hospital that clung to her clothes. Each mile toward Devil's Creek felt like traveling backward through time, unraveling the careful construction of Dr. Sarah Chen to reveal someone she'd buried beneath years of medical training and professional expectations. The deposition was in 4 hours. Morrison would arrive at his office to find an empty chair across from his conference table, no defendant to systematically destroy. The thought should have terrified her. Abandoning the fight meant accepting defeat, letting them paint her as unstable, delusional, a danger to patients. Instead, she felt something approaching relief. Let them have their victory over a ghost. The woman they were prosecuting, the rational physician who believed in protocols and evidence-based medicine, was already dead. She'd been dying for months, suffocating under the weight of trying to squeeze divine calling into diagnostic codes. Tommy's healing had been her funeral pyre, burning away the last pretense that she could serve 2 masters. The road wound higher into the mountains, following the path she'd taken countless times as a child, when her grandmother would bring her up here to gather medicinal herbs. Even then, Sarah had known these expeditions were about more than black cohosh and echinacea. Her grandmother had been teaching her to recognize power in growing things, to understand that healing came from connection rather than control. Medicine treats symptoms, little sparrow, her grandmother's voice whispered from memory. But love heals the person. Sarah's hands tightened on the steering wheel as the familiar landmarks appeared in her headlights. The twisted pine that marked the turnoff to the old logging road, the weathered sign warning of unstable creek banks, the place where, 20 years ago, a 12-year-old girl had discovered that touching the divine came with a price no child should have to pay. She parked where the road ended, grabbing her medical bag out of habit before realizing the absurdity. What use were stethoscopes and surgical tools where she was going? But as she started to set it down, something made her reconsider. The bag represented everything she was leaving behind, but it also contained instruments of healing, imperfect, limited, but born from the same fundamental desire to restore what was broken. The trail to Devil's Creek was overgrown but still passable, her feet remembering the way, even in darkness. Dawn was beginning to touch the eastern peaks, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold that reminded her of the light that had flowed from her hands into Tommy's broken body. As she walked, Sarah felt the weight of consequences settling around her like gravity. By now, Morrison's office would be buzzing with activity, preparing for a deposition that would never happen. Dr. Kovac would be fielding questions about Tommy's miraculous recovery, struggling to find medical language for the impossible. Rebecca would be finishing her shift, carrying the secret of what she'd witnessed. And somewhere behind all of it, 3 families would wake to another day without their children, patients Sarah had failed to save before her gift awakened. The guilt of their loss had nearly destroyed her, but now she understood it differently, not as her failure, but as the breaking that had to happen before she could become who she was meant to be. The sound of running water reached her ears, and Sarah's pace quickened. Devil's Creek ran year-round, fed by snowmelt and mountain springs, but she could hear something different in its voice this morning, an eagerness almost like recognition. She emerged into the clearing where it had all begun, and her breath caught. The stranger was there, exactly as Tommy's drawing had promised. He sat on the same fallen log where she'd found him 20 years ago, no longer bleeding but bearing the same ancient scars she remembered. His clothes were simple: jeans, a flannel shirt, work boots that had seen honest labor. But his eyes held depths that made her feel simultaneously known and undone. "Hello, Sarah." His voice was exactly as she remembered, warm, patient, carrying undercurrents of infinite compassion. The sound of it broke something loose in her chest, 20 years of careful control crumbling like a dam that had outlived its purpose. "You haven't aged," she whispered, setting down her medical bag with trembling hands. "Neither have you, really. The child who healed me is still here, just buried beneath what you thought you had to become." He gestured to the space beside him on the log. "Sit. We have much to discuss and not much time." Sarah approached slowly, her scientific mind cataloguing impossibilities even as her spirit sang with recognition. This was the moment she'd been running from and racing toward her entire adult life. The choice between safety and calling, between the life she'd built and the destiny she'd been born to fulfill. The final confrontation wasn't coming. It was here. Sarah remained standing, every instinct warring between approach and retreat. Not much time before what? Before you have to choose. He leaned forward slightly, hands clasped, and she saw the scars more clearly now, not just on his palms, but thin lines across his wrists, a mark along his side that her child's memory had somehow forgotten. The gift I gave you 20 years ago was always meant to grow. What you did for Tommy last night was just the beginning. Gift. The word came out sharper than she intended. You call it a gift? Do you know what it's cost me? 20 years of feeling like a fraud, trying to be a doctor when I could do things medicine can't explain. 3 patients dead because I was too afraid to use what you gave me. A lawsuit that's destroyed my career. Everything I built, gone. Yes. His response was so simple, so accepting, that it stopped her cold. The old life had to die, Sarah. You couldn't become who you're meant to be while clinging to who you thought you should be. She laughed, the sound bitter in the morning air. Easy for you to say, you're not the one losing everything. Aren't I? He stood now, moving with fluid grace to the creek's edge. Do you think manifestation comes without cost? Every time I appear, every miracle, every moment of divine intervention, it requires sacrifice. The question is whether the gain is worth the loss. Something in his tone made her look at him more carefully. The morning light revealed details her child's memory had missed. The deep lines around his eyes, the weight of exhaustion in his shoulders, the way he held himself like someone carrying an impossible burden. "Who are you?" she whispered. "I think you know." He turned back to face her, and for a moment the familiar features seemed to shift, becoming both more and less than human. The real question is who you're going to be. Sarah's legs finally gave out, and she sank onto the log he'd offered. Her medical bag sat at her feet, instruments of healing that suddenly seemed pathetic compared to the power flowing through this place like an underground river. "The children you saved," he continued, returning to sit beside her. "Tommy and the others Rebecca mentioned, they were all tests. Practice runs for what's coming. What's coming?" He was quiet for a long moment, watching the creek flow past. "The world is sick, Sarah. Not just physically, spiritually, emotionally, at the deepest levels of human connection. Modern medicine treats symptoms brilliantly, but it's forgotten how to heal souls. People are dying not just from disease, but from despair, isolation, the loss of hope in anything beyond what they can measure and control. And you think I can fix that?" The scope of it was crushing. "I'm one person, one very frightened, very fallible person who just destroyed her career healing one child. You're one person who can touch the divine and make it real for others." He turned to face her fully. "Do you remember what you felt when you healed me? Not the fear that came after, the moment itself." Sarah closed her eyes, letting herself remember. The sensation of power flowing through her 12-year-old hands, love made manifest, the absolute certainty that this was why she existed. For 20 years she'd told herself it was trauma, delusion, the fantasy of a child trying to process something terrible. But sitting here now, she could no longer deny the truth. "Perfect peace," she whispered, "like coming home. That's what you offer. Not just physical healing, the restoration of faith in mystery, in love that transcends understanding, in the possibility that broken things can be made whole." His voice grew urgent. "But the cost will be everything you think you need for security. Your medical license is already gone. Your old life, your reputation, your careful plans, all of it has to burn away. And if I say no," she opened her eyes, meeting his gaze, "if I walk away, go to that deposition, try to salvage what's left of Dr. Sarah Chen, then Tommy was your last healing. The gift withdraws, the calling passes to someone else, and you spend the rest of your life wondering what might have been." His expression held infinite compassion but no judgment. "I won't force this, Sarah. It has to be chosen freely with full knowledge of what it costs." Around them, the forest was waking up, birds calling, small creatures stirring, the eternal cycle of life beginning another day. Sarah felt the weight of the moment, understanding that everything hinged on what she said next. Behind her lay the ruins of her medical career. Ahead lay a path she couldn't see clearly, demanding faith in something larger than protocols and peer review. "The others," she said finally. "The children I healed without knowing, were they tests too? They were preparation, teaching you to trust your hands when your mind couldn't understand, building strength for what comes next, which is—" He smiled then, the expression transforming his features with startling beauty. "The real work begins." The words hung between them like a challenge, and Sarah felt something deep within her chest begin to crack. Not breaking, but opening, like ice giving way to spring current. But with the opening came a flood of everything she'd been holding back for 20 years. The real work. She stood abruptly, her voice rising. "You talk about real work like this is some kind of promotion. Do you understand what you're asking me to give up? I spent 8 years in medical school, 4 more in residency, working 20-hour shifts, missing every normal milestone of young adulthood because I believed healing mattered. And now you want me to throw it all away for, what? Some mystical calling that I can't explain to anyone?" He remained seated, unperturbed by her outburst, and somehow his calm made her anger burn hotter. "Those 3 children who died, Marcus, Elena, little James, they trusted me. Their families trusted Dr. Sarah Chen. And I failed them because I was too afraid to use whatever this is." She gestured wildly at her hands. "If I'd accepted this gift sooner, they might still be alive. Their blood is on my hands either way." "Is it?" His voice was gentle but unyielding. "Or is their death on the hands of someone who wasn't yet ready to become who they needed to be?" The question hit like a physical blow. Sarah spun to face him, and for the first time since childhood, she let herself truly look at him, not the familiar stranger from her memory, but whatever he actually was. The morning light seemed to bend around him, and those scars on his hands pulsed with faint luminescence. "You don't get to absolve me," she said, her voice breaking. "You don't get to appear after 20 years and tell me it was all part of some divine plan. Those children suffered. Their parents are still suffering. And you—" She took a step closer, trembling with rage and grief and desperate need. "You could have saved them yourself. If you're what I think you are, what Tommy's drawing suggests, you could have walked into that ER and healed everyone. Why make me choose? Why make me the instrument of failure or salvation?" He stood now, and she saw something flicker across his features. Not anger, but deep, ancient pain. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of countless similar confrontations across millennia. Because healing without choice isn't healing at all. It's magic. Parlor tricks. Divine power imposed from the outside changes nothing fundamental about the human heart. He moved closer, and she could feel energy radiating from him like heat from a forge. But healing that flows through human hands, human choice, human willingness to risk everything for love, that transforms both the healer and the healed. "That's a beautiful philosophy," Sarah shot back. "But those children are still dead." "Yes, and their deaths taught you something that no amount of success could have. That healing isn't about your power, your skill, or your righteousness. It's about surrender to something larger than yourself." The words pierced through her defenses, and suddenly she was 12 years old again, kneeling in the snow beside a dying stranger, her small hands pressed against wounds that should have been fatal. She remembered the terror, not of his blood or his pain, but of the moment when her own will had dissolved completely, becoming a channel for something vast and terrible and beautiful. "I'm not strong enough," she whispered, the admission torn from the deepest part of her soul. "I've spent 2 decades building walls against that feeling of complete helplessness, complete dependence on grace. The idea of living that way permanently," she shook her head. "What if I fail again? What if I accept this calling and the next Tommy dies because I'm not enough?" He reached out then, his scarred hands covering hers, and the touch sent electricity up her arms. "Sarah, look at me." She forced herself to meet his eyes, and in their depths she saw not judgment but recognition, the look of someone who understood exactly what surrender cost. Strength was never the qualification, he said quietly. Weakness willing to be transformed, that's what changes the world. The children who died, the career you're losing, the life you thought you wanted, all of it was preparation for this moment. The moment when you stop trying to be strong enough and start trusting that you don't have to be. The forest around them had gone completely silent, as if the entire world was holding its breath. Sarah could feel her old life slipping away like water through her fingers, Dr. Chen with her protocols and her desperate need for control. But underneath the grief of that loss, something else was stirring. The child who had once touched the face of God and made him whole. "If I say yes," she said, her voice barely audible, "there's no going back." "No," he confirmed, "but there's also no going forward while clinging to what you've outgrown." Sarah closed her eyes and felt the moment crystallize around her, the final choice that would determine not just her future, but the fundamental nature of who she would become. Behind her lay safety, failure, the familiar weight of human limitations. Ahead lay mystery, terror, and the possibility of becoming something the world desperately needed. The confrontation wasn't with him. It was with herself. Sarah opened her eyes and spoke the words that would unmake everything she'd been. "I accept." The moment the words left her lips, the world exploded into light, not the harsh fluorescence of the ER or the sterile brightness of operating theaters, but something alive, golden, warm, terrible in its beauty. It poured from the stranger's hands into hers, and she felt herself being rebuilt from the cellular level up. But with the light came the price. Images flooded her mind like a dam bursting, herself at 40, hands glowing as she touched the face of a child the oncologists had given up on. At 50, kneeling in refugee camps where medicine had no answers for souls shattered by war. At 60, teaching others to channel what couldn't be taught in any medical school. And the cost, always the cost, the loneliness of being set apart, of carrying power that made normal relationships impossible, the weight of choosing who lived and who died, not through medical triage but through divine calling. The endless travel, the sleepless nights, the way people would look at her with desperate hope she couldn't always fulfill. "My license," she gasped as the visions continued. "My credentials." "Worthless where you're going," he said, but his voice was kind. "The hospitals that will need you don't check board certifications. The children you'll heal won't care about your malpractice insurance." She saw herself standing in the ruins of her apartment, the medical journals she'd collected for a decade scattered like autumn leaves, the diploma she'd hung with such pride becoming just paper and ink, meaningless against what she was becoming. Her savings account, already depleted by legal fees, emptying completely as she learned to live on faith instead of salary. "My reputation, everything I built on a foundation of lies," he said gently. "The lie that you could serve healing while denying the source of your gift. The lie that you could help people by staying safely within systems that treat symptoms while ignoring souls." More visions. Herself sleeping in her car outside a children's hospital, waiting for the divine whisper that would tell her which room held her next calling. Learning to live on donations, on the kindness of strangers, on the miraculous provision that came to those who truly trusted. The terror of never knowing where the next meal would come from, balanced against the indescribable joy of watching the impossible become routine. "I'll lose my home," she said, the words torn from her throat. "Yes, but you'll find your true home in the place between heartbeats where healing lives." She saw herself at 35, older but somehow more luminous, her hands steady as she touched a grandmother dying of grief more than cancer. At 40, teaching a young boy to understand that the seizures he'd been medicated for were actually visions, divine gifts that needed guidance, not suppression. At 50, her hair silver but her power undimmed, becoming the teacher she'd never expected to be. And through it all, the loneliness. The weight of being set apart not by choice but by calling. the way potential lovers would pull back when they felt the otherness radiating from her skin. The friends who would drift away, unable to reconcile the Sarah they'd known with whatever she was becoming. The family gatherings that would become impossible because her very presence made people uncomfortable with their ordinary lives. "I'll be alone," she whispered. "Never alone," he corrected, "but often lonely. The price of touching the divine is that human connection becomes both more precious and more difficult." The light was fading now, settling into her bones like warmth after hypothermia, but the visions continued, herself at 60, standing in a clearing much like this one, facing another frightened healer who'd been running from their calling for decades. The cycle continuing, the gift passed down through generations of broken, willing hearts. She saw her own death, decades hence, surrounded not by family or medical colleagues, but by the countless souls she'd touched. Children grown into healers themselves. Parents who'd learned to see miracles as ordinary grace. A network of light that had spread across the world simply because one terrified doctor had finally said yes. "The lawsuit," she said, grasping at the last threads of her old life. "Morrison, the hospital board, will discover that Dr. Sarah Chen died in a car accident on a mountain road at dawn," he said simply. "The woman they're prosecuting no longer exists. The woman you're becoming never signed their contracts or took their oaths." Understanding crashed over her like cold water, not just the loss of her career, but the literal death of her identity. Social security numbers and driver's licenses and credit scores, all the bureaucratic machinery that defined existence in the modern world, would have to be abandoned. She would become a ghost, living in the spaces between official recognition and divine calling. "I'm scared," she admitted, the confession falling from her lips like a prayer. "Good," he said, and smiled with infinite compassion. "Fear means you understand the magnitude of what you're accepting." The transformation was complete. Sarah Chen, MD, was gone. What remained had no name yet, but bore hands that could reshape the world. The silence stretched between them like a held breath, and she could feel the weight of what she'd become settling into her bones. The forest around Devil's Creek continued its ancient rhythms, water flowing over stones, wind stirring pine needles, birds calling to their mates, but she was no longer part of their ordinary world. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice unfamiliar in her own ears. Even speaking felt different, as if the words were coming from some deeper place within her chest. He stood, brushing pine needles from his clothes with movements that seemed almost ritualistic. "Now you learn to live as what you've become. The transition period is always the hardest. Your old instincts will pull toward familiar patterns, while your new nature pushes toward uncharted territory." Sarah looked down at her hands, half expecting them to glow or show some visible sign of transformation. They appeared unchanged, still the long fingers that had sutured thousands of wounds, the familiar scar from a scalpel accident during residency, the callus from years of gripping pens to write prescriptions. But underneath the surface, she could feel power humming like electricity through copper wire. "Will I see you again?" The question surprised her with its urgency. After 20 years of running from this moment, the idea of facing what came next without guidance terrified her. "When you need me," he said simply. "But Sarah," he paused, and she saw something almost parental in his expression. "You won't need me as much as you think. The calling chose you because you already have everything required. Trust that." A car door slammed somewhere in the distance, the sound jarring her back to immediate reality. Her rental car sat where she'd abandoned it hours ago, keys probably still in the ignition. Beyond that lay the drive back to Mercy General, where her former colleagues would be starting morning rounds, reviewing cases, living the life she'd just surrendered. "The hospital," she said, panic fluttering in her throat. "My shift. I'm supposed to be—" "Dr. Sarah Chen is supposed to be at a deposition this morning," he reminded her gently. "A legal proceeding that no longer applies to someone who no longer exists in those systems." The full weight of her new reality crashed over her again. No job to return to, No apartment lease in her name, no credit cards or bank accounts or insurance policies. She was as thoroughly erased from the official world as if she'd never been born. How do I survive? The question came out smaller than she'd intended, tinged with the terror of someone facing complete uncertainty. One day at a time, one calling at a time. He gestured toward the creek, where morning light danced on moving water. You'll be provided for, but not in ways your old mind would have recognized as security. Food will come from unexpected kindness. Shelter from strangers moved by impulses they don't understand. Transportation from divine appointments disguised as coincidence. Sarah wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly aware of the morning chill. Her scrubs, stolen from the hospital laundry yesterday, felt like a costume she no longer had the right to wear. Even her ID badge, still clipped to her pocket, belonged to a woman who had ceased to exist. The families, she said, thinking suddenly of Tommy's parents, of all the people she'd touched in the ER who would wonder what happened to the doctor, who'd seemed to understand their pain so completely. They'll ask questions. Let them. His expression grew thoughtful. Sometimes the questions are more important than the answers. Sometimes people need to wonder about miracles, to carry that uncertainty until it transforms into something larger. He began walking toward the tree line, his movements fluid and purposeful. Sarah felt a moment of pure panic, the child in her desperate not to be abandoned again. But something deeper recognized that this goodbye was different from their first parting. This time, she wasn't being left behind. She was being set free. Wait, she called after him, and he turned back with infinite patience. What do I call myself now? Who am I supposed to be? He smiled, and for a moment she saw in his face the reflection of every healer who had ever made this choice, every person who had traded earthly security for divine calling. You'll know when it matters, he said. Names have power, but they also have limits. Let yourself grow into what you're becoming before you try to contain it with words. Then he was gone, not vanishing in a flash of light or supernatural display, simply absent the way morning mist disappears when you're not looking directly at it. Sarah stood alone beside Devil's Creek, feeling the enormous space where her old life used to be and the infinite possibility of what lay ahead. Her hands tingled with residual power, and somewhere in the distance she could feel it, the first calling of her new existence, faint but insistent as a heartbeat. A child who needed her, a family desperate for hope, a miracle waiting to unfold through willing hands. Sarah Chen was dead. What remained had work to do. The calling pulled her south. She drove for 3 hours through Montana back roads, following an internal compass that had nothing to do with maps or GPS. The rental car's radio crackled with static. Something about her transformation had made electronic devices unreliable, so she traveled in silence, watching the landscape change from mountain forest to rolling plains. The sensation guiding her felt like hunger but deeper, a gravitational pull towards suffering that needed her specific touch. She'd experienced echoes of it during her medical career, the inexplicable urge to check on certain patients, the way some cases called to her more urgently than clinical priority suggested. Now she understood those moments had been preparation, her gift testing its boundaries within the constraints of her old life. The town, when she found it, was barely a cluster of buildings around a grain elevator. Population maybe 300, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone and strangers were noticed immediately. She parked outside a weathered diner and sat for a moment, feeling the pull intensify. Inside the diner, conversation stopped. Not hostile attention, but the curious wariness small towns reserved for outsiders. She looked like what she was, a woman in medical scrubs who'd been awake all night, carrying herself with the careful exhaustion of someone navigating internal upheaval. Coffee? The waitress was maybe 60, grey hair pulled back, eyes that had seen enough of life to recognize when someone was running from or toward something significant. Please, Sarah's voice came out hoarse. She realized she hadn't spoken to another human being since he'd disappeared by the creek. I'm looking for someone who might need help. Medical help. The woman, her name tag read Betty, set down the coffee mug with deliberate slowness. You a doctor? I was. The truth of that statement surprised her. Not a lie, not deflection, but simple honesty about what she'd been versus what she was becoming. Now I'm something else. Betty's expression shifted, and Sarah felt the first stirring of recognition. This woman understood about callings that transcended professional credentials. The Martinez boy, Betty said quietly, glancing toward the kitchen where a man in a cook's apron was pretending not to listen. Been sick for months. Family can't afford the specialists in Billings and the local clinic. She shrugged, a gesture that contained volumes about rural healthcare limitations. Sarah's hands began to tingle. What's wrong with him? Doctors say cancer. Leukemia, maybe. He's 8 years old and he's dying. Betty's voice carried the particular grief that small communities felt when children suffered. His mama cleans houses to pay for treatments that aren't working. The pull intensified, becoming almost physical. Sarah could sense the child now, maybe 6 blocks away, his life force flickering like a candle in wind. But underneath the illness, she felt something else, a spirit fighting with fierce determination, a soul too bright to be extinguished by failing cells. Where? She asked, already standing. Betty gave her an address, then caught her arm. Honey, I don't know what kind of doctor you were, but that family's been through enough false hope. If you can't help that boy, I can help him. The certainty in her own voice startled her. Not arrogance, she was far too aware of the mysteries she'd accepted to claim perfect knowledge. But for the first time since her transformation, she felt the absolute confidence that came with aligning herself to divine purpose. The Martinez house was a small ranch home, with a carefully tended garden and children's toys scattered across the front yard. Sarah knocked, and when the door opened, she found herself facing a woman her own age, worn thin by months of watching her child suffer. Mrs. Martinez? Sarah stopped, realizing she had no credentials to offer, no title that would explain her presence. I heard about your son. I'd like to help. Suspicion and desperate hope warred in the woman's eyes. Are you with the clinic? Because we already told them we can't afford. I'm not with anyone. Sarah held up her hands, and in the afternoon light filtering through the screen door, she could swear her palms glowed faintly. I know he's sick, and I think I can help. Something in her tone must have convinced the woman, because she stepped aside. Miguel's in his room, sleeping mostly these days. Sarah followed her down a hallway lined with family photographs, birthday parties, school pictures, the gradual documentation of a boy growing weaker. At the end of the hall, a door stood ajar. Inside, she found him, 8 years old, as Betty had said, but appearing younger due to the ravages of illness. His skin had the translucent quality that came with severe anemia, and she could hear the labored rhythm of his breathing from across the room. But when she knelt beside his bed and placed her hands on his forehead, she felt it immediately. The same power that had flowed through her 20 years ago in the snow, the same impossible energy that had rebuilt a dying stranger beside Devil's Creek. Miguel's eyes opened, and he smiled at her as if they were old friends. I've been waiting for you, he whispered. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. The boy's words echoed with the same impossible knowing she'd encountered in the stranger's eyes, a recognition that transcended ordinary understanding. Miguel's small hand reached up to cover hers, and the moment their skin touched, the healing began. It was different from that desperate night 20 years ago. Then, she'd been a terrified child pouring everything she had into keeping someone alive. Now, she felt the power flow through her with practiced ease, like water finding its natural course. The energy moved from her heart through her arms, warm and golden, and absolutely certain of its purpose. Miguel's breathing deepened. Color returned to his cheeks as his bone marrow remembered how to create healthy cells. Sarah watched in wonder as his body rebuilt itself on a molecular level, not just healing the cancer, but strengthening him beyond what he'd been before the illness began. Mija? Mrs. Martinez appeared in the doorway, her voice barely a whisper. "What's happening?" Sarah looked up to find the woman staring at her son with the expression of someone witnessing the impossible. Miguel was sitting up in bed, his eyes bright and clear, grinning with the irrepressible energy of a healthy 8-year-old. "I feel amazing, Mama," he said, bouncing slightly on the mattress, "like I could run for miles." Sarah stood slowly, her hands still tingling with residual power. Mrs. Martinez fell to her knees beside the bed, gathering her son into her arms and sobbing with relief that seemed to shake the foundations of the small room. Over Miguel's shoulder, his mother looked at Sarah with an expression that contained gratitude too vast for words. "Who are you?" "Someone who was supposed to be here," Sarah said simply. It was the truest answer she could give. Word spread quickly through the town. By evening, families began arriving at the Martinez home. A woman whose arthritis had kept her bedridden for months, a teenager with seizures the specialists couldn't control, an elderly man whose heart was failing. Sarah discovered that her transformation had given her more than the ability to heal. She could sense exactly what each person needed, could feel the specific frequency of restoration their bodies required. She worked through the night, her hands moving from person to person with growing confidence. Each healing taught her something new about her gift, about the delicate balance between medical knowledge and divine intervention. The seizures stopped not through neurological repair, but through helping the boy understand that his episodes were actually moments of heightened spiritual sensitivity. The arthritis dissolved as she helped the woman release decades of accumulated grief that had crystallized in her joints. By dawn, word had spread to neighboring towns. Cars lined the small street, people camping in their vehicles waiting for their turn. Sarah realized she was looking at her new life, an endless procession of need, an infinite calling that would take her wherever suffering waited for her touch. Betty from the diner arrived with coffee and sandwiches, setting up an informal support station in the Martinez front yard. "Figured you might need sustenance," she said with a knowing smile. "This kind of work takes everything out of a person." "How did you know?" Sarah asked, accepting the coffee gratefully. "My grandmother had the gift," Betty replied quietly. "Smaller than yours, maybe, but I recognize the signs. The way electronics get funny around you now. The way people feel calm just being near you. The way you look like you're carrying light under your skin." Sarah touched her reflection in the diner window. Betty was right. Something fundamental had changed in her appearance. She looked older in some ways, younger in others, more present somehow, as if she'd finally grown into herself after 32 years of waiting. A car pulled up, and a man in an expensive suit climbed out. Sarah's stomach clenched as she recognized Morrison's lawyer, the one who'd been pursuing the malpractice case with ruthless determination. He approached with the careful steps of someone entering foreign territory. "Dr. Chen, I've been looking for you. We need to discuss." He stopped mid-sentence, staring at her face. "You look different." "I am different," she said calmly, "and Dr. Chen no longer exists. I don't understand. The lawsuit, the depositions." "Find yourself a new defendant," Sarah suggested gently. "That woman died yesterday morning." He left without another word, shaking his head and muttering about professional responsibility. Sarah watched him go with something approaching pity. He would never understand that some transformations made earthly concerns irrelevant. Months passed in a blur of faces and healings and endless travel. Sarah learned to live without permanent address, sleeping in guest rooms and church basements and sometimes under stars. She discovered that the universe provided exactly what she needed, sometimes through obvious kindness, sometimes through seeming coincidence that revealed itself as perfect timing. She was no longer Dr. Sarah Chen. The people she helped called her different things: sister, angel, the healing woman. She answered to all of them and none of them, understanding finally that names were less important than purpose. And late at night, in quiet moments between callings, she felt his presence nearby, watching, approving, ready to catch her if she fell. She had found her way home.